Eh bien, bonjour à tous, Michael Sinatra, la directeur du Centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur les métiers numériques, basé à l'Université de Montréal, avec nos collègues de McGill et Concordia. Et c'est notre grand plaisir aujourd'hui, pour notre séance entre membres, d'accueillir Darren Wershler de l'Université de Concordia, qui est une chaire de recherche de Concordia sur les médias, qui va nous parler de son projet Residual Media Depot.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. I'm always pleased to see people on a Friday afternoon. So what I want to talk about today is a relatively new project for me. It's a project of the Media History Research Center in the Milieu Institute at Concordia, and it's been funded by a combination of my research chair, the Immerse Partnership Grant Network, and the Dean of Arts and Science at Concordia. And it's been around since about 2016, so about a year and a half. And I'm very careful about what I call this, and I thought for a long time about what I would like to call it, because of course, the temptation right now to call something an archive or to call something a lab is very, very strong. And that's fine as long as you don't talk to any actual archivists or any actual laboratory workers or any actual scientists, but those words carry a lot of freight. And we can talk a bit about why I ended up calling this what I did. In part, it was a matter of convenience because the space that I was given for it was actually a former video depot. So calling it the Residual Media Depot seemed like a logical decision, but it was also a very deliberate one. I'm in the middle of writing a book about media labs and humanities labs right now, and I've been working with a lot of archivists and thinking about the difference between archives and repositories for a few years. So the decision to not call it a lab and to not call it an archive is a very deliberate one. Research collections themselves are a very interesting topic and something that I've been thinking about a lot. Research collections are actually very, very old, and they've been part of universities around the world for centuries and had kind of disappeared at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century for a variety of reasons, and seem to be emerging in a residual fashion now. People are appearing with collections for a variety of reasons, or things are emerging. And in part, I think it has to do with the shift from analog to digital. My colleague Jason Camlott has a project that began with this set of reel-to-reel tapes of poetry recordings that had been done at Sir George Williams University by George Bowring in the 60s and 70s. And they just sat moldering on the department chair's shelf for decades until suddenly there was this kind of collective urgency. We have to digitize everything. Everything must be online. And suddenly there's this convenient source of tri-council funding to do that as well. So there are imperatives that happen because of technological shifts, and there are imperatives that happen because of the availability of grant money. But research collections are quite old. This is a picture of the scientific instruments collection at the University of Toronto. Harvard has a scientific instrument collection that's several hundred years old, and there are many of these in Europe. But we tend now only to find research collections in departments like geology or anthropology or archaeology. Sometimes private collections, end up in professors' offices for a variety of reasons, but we're not really sure what to do with them in the contemporary university. And I'm intrigued by this idea, so I've been doing some research around it, and I'm probably going to end up writing about it as well. But it seemed like the most apt way to describe what it was we were doing. Now, why did I start this? Many of you probably know about TAG, the Center for Technoculture, Art, and Games at Milieu, which is one of the largest research units in Milieu, and it's sort of the model for the whole institute. And many of my graduate students belong to TAG. And I walked upstairs one day, and I found one of my PhD students, and I said, Will, I need a cable to plug in my Xbox. And he said to me, we don't have anything that old. Now, the Xbox was discontinued in 2009. And I have a problem with much of game studies because it tends to be very presentist, and there are practical reasons for this. Students are interested in what's going on at the moment, and they're interested in network digital media, and their sense of themselves as consumers is all imbricated with themselves as scholars. So it's a complicated thing to unpack. And there are a variety of reasons that it doesn't happen, but this annoyed me so much that I immediately went back down to my office and ordered several $1,000s of old video game equipment. This is my operating thesis, and I keep this slide in here just to annoy Bart Simon, but I really do believe that game studies needs a better sense of media history. It needs not just a sense of its own history as a discipline, but it needs the kinds of insights that media history can provide, ties to cultural studies that media history has, and so on and so forth. And I'm not a game studies guy. I'm a media historian, and game consoles right now happen to be my object of interest. So I think that's an important distinction as well. So of course, the first thing that I did when I started to think about what we were going to do is I tried to map it all out. And one of the ways that I do this habitually is with the blackboard in the Media History Research Center. So I just threw everything up on the wall and very quickly came to this as a kind of mission statement of what we're interested in is collaborative interdisciplinary research into the technological, cultural, discursive, and institutional aspects of material media collections. And my physical space is quite humble. It literally is a former media depot. The wall on the far end there is a roll-up door, like you might find on the front of a bodega or a small supermarket or something. It cranks up so you can get carts in and out. And I have a row of steel shelves along one wall with most of the collection on it and workbenches on the other. The armchairs pull out into the sort of front foyer area by the stairs, along with various kinds of screens on carts. So it's actually a pretty good space because people are always going by it. You have to go by the depot to get to anything else on the floor. So I see people all of the time, and all kinds of interesting things happen as a result of that. So that the space has been really fortunate in that respect, even though we don't have very much. It's worth thinking about space because securing space and infrastructural resources is only the beginning of a long series of bureaucratic negotiations that you have to go through as a scholar. And this is one of the reasons that research collections are sort of thin on the ground these days, is they take up room. And if there's one thing that universities don't have a lot of, it's room. So simply in order to make the thing happen, you have to have the space to put it in. And that's never a simple proposition. Once you've got the space, you have to hang on to the space. And then you have to convince campus services to put electricity into it. And that took 6 months. And, make sure that the lighting is right. And so, will they put windows in? Yes, one person says yes, one person says no. So it's one of the aspects of being an academic and trying to figure these things out is this sort of Kafkaesque need to negotiate with complex bureaucracy. So what's actually in here? Well, there are 4 things in this space. It started out, and I just decided I was going to collect major instances of early video game consoles. So 1972 to 2002, complete in box when possible. And that started out being the core of the collection, and it didn't take long. And within about a year, I'm reasonably certain that we had the largest institutional collection of boxed video game consoles in the country. Again, it's surprising in some senses, but not in others, because this is just the kind of thing that universities are bad at doing. So what do we have? We have 4 kinds of things in the depot. There are the boxed consoles. And secondly, and this is where the emphasis for the depot is increasingly, is on modified consoles. People do all kinds of ridiculous things to old video game hardware. The one that interests me the most is they modify them to output better quality video than the original consumer application would have suggested. Many video game consoles from the first and second generation will actually output a true RGB signal. So if you know how to get it out of the console and you know what you can connect it to, it will look better than anything that anyone ever saw in a living room in the early 1980s or late 1970s. So the network of people that produces these things is really interesting. And this is going to end up being a book, I think, because it's intensely complex and difficult to negotiate, which makes it kind of interesting as an object of study. So the focus of the kinds of modified consoles that I'm collecting is ones that have been modified to put out a true RGB signal or an HDMI signal increasingly, although there are other kinds of modifications that we have as well. And the third thing that nobody else seems to have is the signal processing equipment to make this all work. It requires, in order to take an old video game console, especially a modified one, and connect it to any kind of display, you need a variety of devices that you can usually only find from suppliers of the kind of equipment that make a professional auditorium or a video console in a classroom work, or high-end prosumer equipment, again from the late 80s or early 1990s. And all of this stuff, when it was new, was heinously expensive, tens of thousands of dollars in some cases for a single box. You can usually find it on eBay for a couple of $100s or less if you know where to look. But even the cables are expensive. There are two reliable sources of the cables to make all of this work in the world. There's a woman in Florida and there's a guy in England. And by the time you get the cable to Canada, it will probably cost you $80 or $90 per cable. So there's this little box that sits under one end of the bench, and it has like thousands of dollars in video cables in it. It's kind of astonishing. And then the fourth thing began as a kind of pragmatic question. And the question was, if I ever get around to exhibiting this stuff, it'll all go on tables. So what goes on the walls? And then I started to think about arcade marquees, the things that used to be in the top of arcade cabinets, which again are relatively cheap if you know where to look, but they're vanishing because there is a growing base of hobbyists who renovate old cabinets. And there's an even larger group of hobbyists who make cabinets from scratch and use silk-screened or giclée printed replicas of the arcade marquees. So the originals are getting very, very hard to find. So I have a stack of these things. So those are the four things that are actually in the depot. This is the console wall along the backside, and my students are going through this at the moment, cleaning and databasing everything. I kept the boxes for a reason. And the reason is that the space itself makes a kind of argument, one of a number of arguments that I want to make about German media archaeology, and particularly in the style of Wolfgang Ernst. Some of you have probably seen pictures of the media archaeological fundus, yes? Okay, the fundus it's literally the basement of the building that Ernst works in. And it has shelves all around the room with all of these old pieces of technological equipment dating back over several hundred years, completely bare. No boxes, no manuals, no styrofoam, no cords, nothing. And when I look at that room, it seems mute to me because it lacks all of the material externalities that would allow you to understand the social protocols that actually make the technological media do something, right? And Ernst's form of media archaeology is, Jussi Perekka calls it a kind of channel, right? He says it's a very specific thing, and it's designed to interrogate the way that the device processes signals and literally nothing else. But the argument that I've come to increasingly by trying to do that is you cannot make sense of how the device processes signals without paying attention to the cultural and social externalities of it. So you need the boxes in order to make sense of things. You can't do it without them. So I kept everything. The second thing, the modded consoles, they're interesting to me because I'm increasingly interested in cultural technique theory and in what British cultural studies talks about as articulation theory. The practices, the techniques, and the operations that allow us to use devices and, again, to make sense out of them in a particular social and historical and cultural context. This is the motherboard of the first modified console that we got, which was a Nintendo Entertainment System Model 1 NES that had been modified to output RGB signals. And the first time I opened it up, I was scared out of my mind, which again is also important, because there are lots of reasons that you should open things up. We'll talk a bit about that too today, I hope. But if you've done it a few times, it starts becoming less intimidating very, very quickly. And I think there are good pedagogical reasons for doing that. The third thing, the signal processing here, is really interesting. These are artifacts that are the result of a very complex culture of micromanufacturing and circulation that spans the entire globe. This thing is called an SLG in a box, and it's made by a company in Germany called Arcade Forge. And it has three things in it. The big green board in the middle is, the name for it is, it's a Gonbez 8200. And what a Gonbez 8200 does is allow you to plug a computer into an old CRT monitor. Every cheap arcade cabinet in the world for the last few decades has had one of these boards in it. It's connected to two other things, one on each side. And one of them is called a sync stripper. And what it does is it takes the synchronization information that comes from the video game console along with the red, the green, and the blue signal, and it cuts it out so that the computer can make sense of it. The other board is called a scanline generator, and it's intensely interesting because what it does is, you know, on an old cathode ray tube television, the lines that go back and forth, those are called scan lines, and they're a result of the electron gun painting the picture on the TV tube over and over and over. It turns out that people who are interested in old video games are intensely nostalgic about that pattern. And this guy invented a device that makes them on digital screens. And it has been copied and recopied and innovated to the point where it is now starting to appear in commercial devices. And people are fussy about it. You can set the scan lines as like odd or even. You can adjust the darkness. You can make them thinner or thicker. There are even hybrid scan lines that make some parts of the picture look like they're scanned and others not, which is physically impossible, but aesthetically really pleasing, right? So this is one of the reasons that I got interested in this problem of signal processing and culture, was by thinking about scanline generators. And I have a whole paper about digital nostalgia and scanlines that's in the work. But these kinds of devices, they're made by people all over the world. And the manufacturing environment in China in particular is such now that you can design a board, you can find somebody to manufacture it for you in a quantity of 100, 200 in China. They make money off of it. Like that's the astonishing thing about the culture of manufacturing that we're talking about, is that it's profitable to do this. The board gets shipped to you, you assemble it in your living room or your garage, and then you resell it to a bunch of other people who install it in video game consoles somewhere. And just thinking about that as a kind of moment, you know, in the development of late capitalism is intensely interesting. So I've been thinking about that as a kind of problem too. And then the fourth thing are the arcade marquees, which they're interesting for a whole variety of reasons, but I tend to think of them as they're the material traces of a vanishing social technology. Like, again, the cultural and social context is always important when you're trying to explain technology, you know, particularly to students. Like, I can show them pictures of the inside of an arcade from the late 1970s, but they'll never, like, they don't understand that the room would have been filled with smoke, for example. Like, that's just missing from all of the information that you need, you know, about how to make sense of it, or the incredible volume, or the fact that the heat probably wasn't on in the middle of the winter, and so on and so forth. So all of that contextual information is really important, but all we have are these kind of odd fragments. So it's useful as a kind of allegory for the project as a whole to talk about what's missing when you start thinking about technology. So I want to talk a bit about some of the projects that we have underway. And there are 5 things more or less on the go at once right now. The lab book, a project called Making Room for Consoles, another project called The Cultural Life of Signal Processing, a project on media forensics, and something that we're calling Wiimanufacture. So the first one, the lab book, is a project that I'm working on with UC Perica and Laurie Emerson that's been contracted to University of Minnesota, and it should be done in about a year. And what we're trying to do is sort of think about the role of space in particular in media studies, communication studies, and research creation, you know, sort of broadly speaking. And it's interesting because there's a fairly large literature in science and technology studies now on laboratories, and there's a fair amount of writing on artists' studios as a kind of lab space. But there is this in-between category that again, for administrative reasons, becomes interesting because if you want to get space from your dean, one of the ways to do it is you say, I'm building a lab, and they go, okay, here you go. So there's this kind of cultural moment in which we use the term lab so loosely that it just sort of begs for interrogation. Hudson Bay Company a couple of years ago launched this series of lab couture pieces of clothing, and what was interesting about it was there were no signifiers of science around it whatsoever. You know, you would have expected beakers and clipboards and white lab coats and Bunsen burners or server racks or something, but nothing. You know, just the word lab, which is kind of astonishing to me, right? That the signifier is that empty that we can use it for absolutely anything. So we're starting to think about how this space is made, and I like this photo because this is a photo from an early British French language lab. And if you look at it, the only way that you can make sense of this picture is to realize that it's a composite. Those people have been pasted in there at weird angles, and they're at different exposures. And it's interesting to me because what that means is that the sense of the space as something that's populated needs literally to be produced. Like you need to produce it on the tabletop. And the picture makes a kind of argument by virtue of it being collaged in this sort of way that, you know, look at all of this activity going on in here at once. There's even a guy that I think might be in here twice. I'm trying to decide if the guy on the far side and the one standing in front of the vowel chart is actually the same person. It might be. So those are, you know, some of the kinds of things that we're working through. And again, I'm happy to talk about this project later. The second project expands out of the kinds of arguments that Lynn Spiegel makes about television coming into the suburban home in post-war America. An amazing book called Make Room for TV. And what she talks about is the way that the space of the house literally had to change in order to make room for this technology. And the TV presents itself as a kind of technological solution to a social problem. What do we do about rebellious teenagers and shell-shocked husbands and annoyed wives who've been told that they can no longer work and have to go back and be homemakers? What do we do about that? And the television was presented as the solution for that, along with this kind of image of the family sitting in a circle around it. And the word togetherness was actually coined in women's magazines at this period in order to talk about this relationship. So this is a point that's important to Spiegel and to Carolyn Marvin, is that technology always has these vast discursive apparatuses around them that make sense out of what the technology does. And this is another reason that I keep the boxes, is because that visual argument is very much part of the cultural imaginary of video game boxes. And one of the things that I've been working on is this kind of chronology of shots of video game boxes. And the early ones all look like this, where you have the family unit gathered around the TV in that kind of Spiegel version of togetherness. And this is why the early consoles are all wood grain too, right? Because like the TV itself, they were supposed to be an important piece of furniture. Now, as you go along, something interesting starts to happen in the box art. The family starts to disappear. You start to have first images of young boys, or, I mean, first of all, it's couples after the family, as you have couples in this kind of weird romantic tension between a man and a woman playing video games. And then the couple disappears and there are only young boys. And then the boy disappears and you only get the console, and then the console disappears and you only have the logo. So there are variations on this, but again, if you sort of think about the way that the cultural imaginary is being shaped by the language of advertising, that's something that you can only see by looking at the boxes. You can't get it from the console itself. And then I started taking the idea of room a little more literary, and I started thinking about really banal things like chord length, because if you measure the chords on the early Nintendo machines, they're quite short. You know, they're maybe that long, and they're designed to be used in a four tatami apartment, right, where you have a very, very tiny living space. But the early machines, like the Atari 2600, the chords are enormous, 25, 30 feet long, because they're designed for American living rooms. So there's this whole a different set of assumptions about where these things are going to be used and how they're going to be used that you can, discern in part from the physical externalities of the machine. Signal processing. Now, I've talked a bit about this around the scan lines, and this image is from a Sega Dreamcast connected to a VGA flat screen monitor. So there should be no scan lines in it at all. But I have this weird little box that I bought from these brothers in Turkey that make a device that translate. They must have sold a lot of Dreamcasts in Turkey. This is kind of an interesting question that arises from this, because they only make Dreamcast related hardware. But what this box does is it takes the signal from the Dreamcast, it inserts scan lines, and it converts it to VGA so that you can output a better quality signal. But there's this kind of hallucinatory intensity to this image that has nothing to do with the way that it would have looked even if you had played it on a TV. And the only way you can make sense out of that is by thinking about the cultural questions around it. Like why would people do this? Like the technological reasons for doing it are minimal. With some kinds of consoles, like say a Nintendo 64, when they start introducing polygons, some of those kinds of images can actually be improved by adding scan lines to them, but that's a minor consideration when you think about all of the kind of iterations that the scan line generators have gone through. So the cultural questions around signal processing are really interesting to me. Media forensics, and this goes back to this sort of theoretical project that I have, where I'm trying to reconcile a kind of Ernstian hard media archaeology with cultural technique theory and articulation theory, because I think the two really need each other. And over the last 30 years, you can see there's this kind of theoretical pendulum that has swung from one extreme to the other. Like if you look at the book that Paul Duguay and Stuart Hall and all of the British cultural studies people did about the Sony Walkman, called Doing Cultural Studies, it's a great book, but everything is in it except the Sony Walkman. There's like literally nothing about the technology at all in that book. And when you go back and look at it now, it seems like this astonishing aporia, but there you have it, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Ernst, who is sort of, Kittler is too busy reading texts, and we don't do that anymore. And this is all about books and literature. And we're interested in the machine and the cold gaze of the scientist and all of that sort of good Ernstian rhetoric, which is nice, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense when you start trying to think about the claims that it's making, because on a technological level, many of them are just wrong. So you need this kind of moment in the middle where the pendulum starts to go back, where you can think about the combination of the real technology that's in front of you, but why it's constructed the way that it is. And this little chip is from a paper that I just did in the issue of Thresholds that came out yesterday. I have a Nintendo Super Famicom, which is the Japanese version of the SNES, that was modified by an engineer in the central USA somewhere so that it would output component video, which are the red, green, and blue cables that many of your televisions still have on the back. And so I wanted to figure out how it worked. And I haven't picked up a soldering iron since the 8th grade. I used to know how to read resistors by the bands on them because they gave us tests. We had to do this in shop class. I've forgotten all of it. So again, I was terrified. I was like, what if I wreck it? What if it never works again? It's like, well, suck it up, let's do it. So I opened the thing up and I worked through it until I figured out how he had done it. And he made this little board and labeled everything on it in red marker and glued all of the pieces down. So I figured out the circuit and figured out how it was different from the other modifications that people had done to this console. And it was actually this really kind of, I think it was an important intellectual experience for me, because it was one of those moments where I made myself do something that I really didn't want to do as a consumer. But it actually made me deal with the technology as more than a set of metaphors, which, again, is something that is very tempting to do. And the last project is something that my students are working on, where we have a bunch of Nintendo Wiis that we've modded to use as emulators. And there are a bunch of reasons to do this. The first and the most obvious is that Wiis are incredibly cheap. You can get one in a canton anywhere in the city for about 25 bucks. It's cheaper than a Raspberry Pi. It puts out a more reliable signal than a Raspberry Pi, and it has better connectivity. So from a pedagogical perspective, if you want to teach video games and emulation in the classroom, these things are very easy to work with. But I also have a background in copyright and cultural policy research, and this is something that Nintendo intensely does not want you to be doing right now. And all over North America, there are legislators who are trying to get anti-repair laws and anti-tinkering laws passed for a variety of crass reasons that should horrify us as scholars, right? Because it literally makes it more difficult to do your job if you can't take something apart and figure out how it works. It takes away rights that we've assumed that we've had as consumers for a very long time if you can't take something that you've owned and make it do something else. So we can talk about that later too, but what's running here, this is the Sega Genesis version of Castle of Illusion running on a Nintendo Wii, which again, should never happen in the real world. It's also running on component cable, which is something that is also unusual because the quality of video here is very high. Pedagogy. I use the Depot as a teaching tool, and I've taught in the year and a half that it's been in existence 3 graduate classes, 2 international summer seminars, and 1 regular graduate class. So 2 of those have been media archaeology courses. And in each case, I've brought in a pair of other scholars for a week and worked with students from all over the world. We've had students from Finland, Spain, China, the United States, England, South America, in just 2 years. So people are interested in this stuff all over the world. And the first time we did this course, I brought up Stephanie Bullock and Patrick Lemieux from UC Davis. They're authors of a book called Metagaming. And one of the things that we do in this course is there's a collective project. And the first time that we did it, we took these Duck Hunt cartridges. So with a group of graduate students, half of whom had never done anything as technical as, say, solder something in their lives, and the other half of whom had never programmed anything in their lives. So we took the cartridges apart, desoldered the ROM chips off of the boards, put them into a ROM dumper, pulled the ROM off of the chip, rewrote it, put the ROM back onto the chip, soldered it back into the cartridge, and we were playing games that the students had modified by the end of the day. Again, an incredibly sort of empowering experience for everybody involved. Patrick has done this workshop a few times now, and he's sort of got it down to a science. So it went very, very quickly and very efficiently. So this is partly about critical making, like how you take the practice of doing things and add an element of criticality to it. How do you build it into your scholarly practice? And I'm interested in this idea that making discursively works as a kind of hinge between a number of disparate fields. Everybody wants to claim making as what they do. So you see it in video game studies and media archaeology and educational technology, and everybody has a slightly different relationship to it. So I think that's kind of an interesting scholarly problem in and of itself. And again, there's a policy layer to this as well. What you're doing is transformative in the sense that you're doing something for your own research purposes, but you're also discussing the policy implications that go along with it as you're producing the thing. And they're complex. There are a lot of unanswered questions about this, or why you might do this, or what it all means. But these are the students and faculty playing those games at the end of the day. The next time we did the class, which was this last summer, I brought in UC and Lori. And the project that we did was we took a $15 IKEA coffee table and we turned them into arcade cabinets. This is something that Anne-Louise Davidson, who runs the Critical Making Lab at Milieu, does with all kinds of groups. She does it with school kids. She does it with university groups. She does it with seniors. And again, you can do it with off-the-shelf parts very quickly in a couple of days. So we were thinking a lot about this question of technique, while we were doing it, and trying to reconcile material approaches to media studies and communication studies with the cultural questions. But it was also truly interdisciplinary in the sense that you had people working with other people who used completely disparate methods. This thing on the back wall here, this is something that Anne-Louise Davidson's students who led the workshop were using as an assessment tool. It's called a Socratic wheel. And it's used in quantifiable research in educational technology to measure sort of your own sense of your experience. So there's a scale of 5 points on each of those arms, and you can assign different values to the arms. So soldering, planning, programming, whatever. The 2 different colored Post-it notes register people's sense of their competency at those skills before and after the event took place. And whether or not you like it as a heuristic was kind of beside the point for me, because I had one group of people who used this tool all the time, absolutely uncritically, like in a completely instrumental way, and another group of people who'd never seen it before in their lives. And making them talk to each other about what they were doing was really interesting from a methodological perspective. The second course, the research collection course, is a newer one, and it comes out of this sense that I have about how the history, structure, and function of university research and teaching collections remains poorly understood and under-theorized. This is what my office looked like when I started to buy stuff for the depot, and I didn't have anywhere to put it yet. One of the places where you start with collections, of course, is with mess, right? And it's a common starting point in actor network theory. John Law has written extensively about mess and its relationship to methodology and how you get from mess to method. So it was kind of a good place to start. And this is something that I think we have to address as a discipline, is that literary studies students are terrible at methodology. They're terrible at identifying that they have methodology. They're terrible at articulating what that is, and they don't understand other kinds of methodology as well. So I've spent an increasing amount of time over the last 3 years just teaching methods. And the methods that are required even to think about things in the aggregate, as opposed to sort of thinking about a single book or the books of a single author, are often quite different. So that's become part of how I approach this course as well. Non-human agency is another big part of this, because anytime that you're dealing with technology, you're dealing with objects that have been invested with agency to a variety of degrees, and you have to address that when you're thinking about what these objects do. And again, you're thinking about things in terms of assemblages, messes, networks, systems of circulation is really important. So just 2 quick things before I stop. One of them is the things that we have on the go right now, and then the other is a sort of series of takeaways. So we're making a bunch of stuff. We're making a database right now that will include the holdings of both the Residual Media Depot here and Laurie Emerson's Media Archaeology Lab at University of Colorado Boulder. I have a series of ruggedized carts that are designed to wheel this equipment through the tunnels at Concordia, which, for some reason are full of very, very tiny tiles, and your cart vibrates constantly. So I had to get these crazy huge wheels just to get this gear back and forth without shaking it off the cart. Arcade cabinets, we have one that is in the process of being renovated, and I think we'll probably try a couple of other forms as well. A portable LAN. I have a student who he's a former world-ranked Halo player, and he has Xboxes that he's won in tournaments over the years. So we're going to build a portable LAN card, because this is one of the forms of gameplay that has sort of vanished, is the local area network. But if you plug 4 Xboxes into the same network, you can have 16 people playing anyway. And this is more about the public face of research. It's like the bait that you put out to get people in the door. So I'm just going to make a cool looking cart with a bunch of Xboxes on it that I can wheel out anywhere and hand controllers to 16 kids just to see what will happen. Super guns, they're a kind of interface that gives you the equivalent of what would be inside an arcade cabinet. They're very easy to build, and we have a few of them. But I would like to be able to give these away at open houses and again, use them at public events. And then one of the more interesting recent things is the earliest 3-color photographs that were produced by this Russian guy, Protokin Gorsky. And what he did was he would have his subject sit down, and then he would hold a red filter, a green filter, and a blue filter in front of the camera in rapid succession, and then superimpose the images, and you could get a color photograph. You can do this with a Game Boy camera. So like if you have one of those cameras that fit into a Game Boy, you can hold a red piece of plastic, a green piece, and a blue piece in front of each other. So we're 3D printing a little rig that will allow you to do this very quickly, because there are a lot of students that are interested in the new aesthetic, and sort of similar kinds of questions in the post-image cluster in Milieu. So they're always around and they're always asking about it. So I finally thought, let's just do it. I'm working on a research network to talk about material media studies and video game hardware. So the people that have been through the depot in the last few years, Rayford Gins, Henry Lowood, UC and Laurie, Stephanie and Patrick, but also people like Matt Kirschenbaum, the kind of early, kind of obvious suspects for something like this, but that's in the works. A series of publications around this. The esports thing has become increasingly of interest, in part because now I have a former competitive Halo player, and I have a new graduate student who's just starting, and she plays competitive Smash all over the world. So doing some research on esports and the political economy of esports in Canada is probably going to be likely. There's a lot of work on the material history of text editing that's going on. It's another student project. We're running a workshop in Philadelphia at Rutgers in a month, at Arcade, regular game nights and those kinds of things. So what do we want to take away from all of this? There's sort of 3 or 4 points that I'd just like to cover quickly. Number one, I've already said this, but the Academy is terrible at capturing the tacit knowledge and expert discourse. Research collections allow you to talk about objects that your library doesn't have, your department doesn't have, the university does not know how to deal with this. And increasingly, this is what my graduate students want to talk about. They're like, let's talk about digitally pirated comic books. Let's talk about role-playing games. Let's talk about fan fiction. Let's talk about video game consoles. The university doesn't have access to any of that and has no idea how to do it. So unless you build the research collection yourself, you have no research object. So that's the first point. And the second one is that it makes no sense to consider signal processing separately from its cultural articulations. And the corollary of that is the other way around, that material technology is not a set of metaphors or themes, and symbolic interpretation alone will fail you. Like if you approach this with hermeneutics and close reading, it will fail you. You need a different set of tools in order to make sense of these kinds of objects. And the final point is that black boxes can be useful, but you can usually open them. It's convenient to treat things as though they are solid, particularly when they're the tools you use in whatever research that you happen to be doing. But when you take the time and you work up the nerve to crack it open and look at it closely, you figure out things that you just would not know otherwise. And that's really it. We have a web page at residualmedia.net, a Flickr page that we're working on, and there's stuff on Twitter all of the time. But this is very new. It's all very tentative, and I am more than happy to show anybody around who wants to make the trip down to Concordia. So thank you very much. Please come and see us.
Thank you, Darren, and been there, so I encourage people to take Darren on his offer to sort of come down. Questions, comments?
I have one. We could see that it was your work is very much signal oriented or hardware oriented. I was wondering, at the end, I've seen one student work is about code, but I was wondering if you were doing some code archaeology or code critique or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not a software studies guy, and that was one of the reasons that I wanted to come and talk to you folks, because it's one of the sort of major differences between digital humanities practice and media theory is media theory and media history doesn't deal as much with software. There are people like it looks like you're writing a letter. Who's the guy that wrote the software studies handbook?
Nick, no,
not Montfort. British guy. He wrote that really amazing early thing on Microsoft Word. It looks like you're writing a letter. Anyway, his name will come back to me. But software studies it's being done better elsewhere. And one of the hard things about trying to figure out this project was, how do I build something that will complement what is happening elsewhere, but is not being duplicated by that.
Mhm.
So for example, I do have some students who work with code and who, write games and look at old games. And there's a whole sort of sphere of activity where people like literally make new games for old hardware.
Yeah.
One of the ones that I run in the depot all the time is called Halo 2600, and it's Halo but for the Atari 2600, which is it's a great game, right? But that's interesting. But I couldn't tell you how it was done because I'm not, in Bogos, I'm not at Montfort. I don't do that kind of work. But at the same time, I will never have a collection as good as the strong collections, history of video games. So the focus on the modified stuff seemed to be the place where I settled. At the same time, I'd like to think of this as a platform that would allow graduate students and postdocs to do that kind of work. And I've already talked to a number, even in the short time that we've been doing this, I've talked to people that are interested in using the collection for things like, one guy was looking at a postdoc on the TRS-80. Somebody else wanted to talk about the TI-99-4A. So if you have an interest in a particular kind of machine and on the things that can be done with it, I can support that. And in fact, I can even shape collection activities to encourage that or develop it. But at this stage, everything is so new that it took a long time for it to. Matthew Fuller, it's the guy I'm thinking of. So when it kind of settles into place, then you can look at it and say, well, what are the possibilities? So I'd like to be able to support that kind of work, even if it's not what I do, because I think the collection is robust enough that it'll allow for that.
So the modded console part.
Yes.
Does it focus on fan practices, or does it focus on hardware? Because it seems that in this archaeology there is a lot about the cultural aspects of it. What you said, but this cultural aspect is really a fan practice.
You could think of it as a fan practice. I like Carolyn Marvin's work on this. She wrote this book called When Old Technologies Were New. And in it, she talks about telegraph operators and telephone operators and early electricians, late 19th century. And what she says about them, again, is that this is primarily a textual community. And they produced an enormous amount of literature. They had their own magazines. They wrote their own novels. Like there was fiction about lonely telegraph operators and, who are the heroes and so on and so forth. And her argument is that all of that writing produces what she calls expert discourse, which is in part about the thing that you're talking about, but it's also about who gets to have an opinion. So whose opinion matters, whose opinion doesn't matter, who's included, who's excluded. And you can use that paradigm to talk about things like, say, just the people who are ColecoVision enthusiasts, or just the people who are Atari 2600 enthusiasts, or the people who do RGB modding. So there are things that fan studies doesn't quite get about that as an approach, because they're constructing a more complex relationship to the object than a fanish relationship. And I know fandom has become much more productive than it was, and there are ways to actually insert yourself into cultural discourse that transmedia has made possible. But so there's a family resemblance, but I think it's slightly different than fandom. But yeah, those communities are really, really interesting to me. And I'm as curious about why people do this and how they do it as I am about the things themselves. But I don't think you can make sense of the one without thinking about the other at the same time.
I have one more question. If can be late.
Go ahead.
Have you tried to compare or to find some similar work that was done on sound? Because it seems there is a big market for all the sound equipment, fire, lamp amplifier, synthesizer, whatever.
It's true. I have a lot of colleagues in the immediate vicinity who do that much, much better though. Like Jonathan Stern is down the street and Jason Camlot's office is around the corner from mine. So Jason and I have actually talked about expanding the collection to include sound equipment. but I know Jonathan Stern has been talking about doing this at McGill for a couple of years, and he owns that field. So
Okay.
like there's no way that I'm gonna like, you know.
Do you know why there is the research on sound equipment and yet a market for it, like professional use, still use some old equipment?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Whereas in video games, it's all.
Well, the video game thing is really interesting because, again, there are sort of three levels of equipment. There's the stuff that people build. There's the prosumer equipment that sort of at the height of when people were interested in things like laser discs. There was a lot of in the home. This guy named Dave Ferrugia invented a chip that became the basis for all contemporary analog high-definition video after that moment. And I have a couple of Ferrugia units that would have cost $15,000 in the late 80s. And again, now you can get them for a couple hundred. And then there's the pro hardware stuff, like the Extron stuff that you can find in any auditorium or any theater in any university. And again, if it's obsolete, you can get it for $70, $80, $100. But you need that in order to make your very old equipment talk to your relatively new equipment. So there are these complex layers to negotiate between it, and just figuring out how to do that stuff is kind of crazy. I never thought when I started teaching video game studies in 2006, and all I really wanted to do was plug an Xbox into a classroom so that I could, show a game to my students. I never thought that I would have to learn signal processing in order to do that, but here we are. So that becomes part of it, is like figuring out what you need and where to get the equipment. There is some dedicated equipment for this. There was a company in Japan called Solaris that made a number of very expensive boxes that take old video game hardware and then translate it into a form that a high-def TV can use. And I have a bunch of that stuff, but it's all just been obsolesced as well. It's all discontinued. So this was the exact right moment to do this, because increasingly people are just making modifications so that the console can go straight to HDMI and skips everything in between. So I've managed to capture this thing at the moment that it was a kind of discursive unit, but it's kind of done and therefore much easier to talk about. So, yeah.
Thanks for presenting your depot. I'd love to pay you a visit.
Please do.
I agree and appreciate you trying to reconcile both the cultural studies of media and media theory. And I'm just curious to know how far you're willing to go on the cultural side. Spiegel's book worked with advertisements, magazines, and newspapers. She also looked at the content of TV programming. So I'm curious, do you have a set of rules of exclusion or inclusion of what comes in the depot?
I mean, one of the beautiful things about discourse analysis is you don't have to exclude anything, right? Like if it's part of the same episteme, right, you have to be able to account for it somehow, because the same set of statements must have made it possible. Must have made it possible to say that at a particular moment and not something else. So there's nothing that I'm going to exclude out of hand. There are some projects that make more sense than others to me immediately. Again, like the cultural imaginary that you see in the video game box art is a kind of obvious one, but it also becomes important to think about things like trying to capture discussion on internet forums, because there are forums that are dedicated to specific consoles. There are forums that are for RGB processing in general. There are ones just for people that collect professional video monitors. There are ones for people who jailbreak video games, so they alter them so that they'll do something else. So there are all of these micro communities doing all of this, producing all of this activity, and most of it will just be lost. So I'm not in a hurry to exclude anything because there's so much to do, but the more that I looked at this stuff, I started out, I thought, all right, well, let's try to take an orthodox Ernstian approach to this, and it just didn't work. Like, if you follow what he says you should be doing, you get to the point where it realizes it doesn't work. You cannot make sense out of the device by simply thinking about the signal processing, because it's interpreted in some context by someone for something. So yeah, like there isn't I haven't found a point yet where I would say no, we're not taking that into account, because I have more than I can do here.
You actually make copies of these forums and keep
Yeah,
them
yeah.
in the depot.
I think it's important, and we all know the average lifespan of a web page is about 4 months. So if you don't copy all of that material, by the time you're done your research, you will be the only one who knows that it ever existed at all. And again, it's a pedagogical problem too, because you have to be able to teach your students not only to do this, but how to do it and which tools to use, which is difficult, right? Because there is this kind of assumption that, because my humiliating live journal page from when I was 14 is still there, that all of this other stuff is going to be there too, and that's just not the case.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is about theory. I'd like to hear you more about the so-called next generation media theory. I was thinking, listening to about the relationship that you kind of approach as to new materialism, especially if you use concepts like essential cuts from Darren Wershler or these kind of things. And the second is to which extent you look also at the museum or the museological question.
Yeah.
The research collection usually, natural history.
Yes. Yeah. Museum studies is the other sort of source for this, other than science and technology studies, and particularly Tony Bennett's work, the Australian Cultural Studies Tony Bennett, not 17-time Grammy-winning Tony Bennett. But he spent a lot of time writing about museums and about the role of the museum as an ideological state apparatus, right? The way that it positions us in relationship to history with a certain kind of reverentiality, the way that it creates certain kinds of narratives by positioning objects and texts and people in relation to each other. So yeah, absolutely, the museological stuff has been essential.
Sort of about stylism,
yes, yeah,
the boundary objects.
Yeah. There again, Susan Starr's work and the stuff about infrastructure, I think is really important. And I mean, this is one of the most interesting directions for me, is that work, which is now reasonably old. That is the hot thing in media studies right now, is everybody wants to talk about infrastructure. So Nicole Starsielski's stuff on undersea cables, and Shannon Mattern's work, and the stuff that's being done on filing cabinets, and it's like all of a sudden everybody wants to do infrastructure and gray literature. It's important to me in part because simply thinking about a collection spatially requires that. What's the institution that has the room? Who do you have to talk to get electrical outlets in it? Is it up to code? All of those kinds of things, right? Those are deeply boring infrastructural questions that require you to fill out a lot of paperwork and to understand what the paperwork does. This is another thing that becomes an important part of the social and cultural context around the objects too, is all of that paper, weird forms that you find that explain something about the institutional history of the object that you're interested in, or its provenance, whether you got it through eBay or from a private collector or an estate sale. All of that paper matters. So that's one of the things that seems to be, like, other than the question of cultural technique itself, after the 2012 issue on cultural technique that UC Parika edited, the infrastructure stuff after Susan Starr is absolutely huge right now. So those are the kinds of things that I've been thinking about a lot, the way that you can use infrastructure studies and cultural technique studies to make sense out of space in labs. One of the spaces around the corner from me that I'm writing about now is, it's called the Speculative Life Lab, and it's run by Tanny Duff, who's in the communications department at Concordia. And she had to go through an enormous application process to get regulation for this space, because what she does research creation where she grows out of human tissue these little sheets of skin infected with the HIV virus, and she makes little books out of them. They're sewn together. So it's a biohazard, and it required an enormous amount of paperwork to get the application to do this. But if you're going to use that space for a classroom, there's a whole other application process that you have to do for that. And so there's this line that goes down the middle of the floor, like a literal line that shows this side is the side that you can handle, biological materials on, and this side is the pedagogical space. And like if you look at like Bernard Sigurd's work on lines as a cultural technique, there, like, you could not ask for a better example, of the way that something that is that basic and that humble does this enormous amount of work for you, right? And it's all tied up in this huge regulatory assemblage that makes this space work. So that's one of the examples that I would sort of cite as a way of saying, okay, this is why the cultural technique work is important. This is why the stuff on infrastructure and gray literature is important. This is why the stuff on spatiality is important. So I hope that helps a bit. Yeah.
What does the metaphor of forensic does differently than reverse engineering?
Yeah.
You use media forensics.
I use media forensics in part because one of the things that I'm pointing to that I didn't really talk about is Matt Kirschenbaum's work. And in Mechanisms, he uses the term media forensics sort of explicitly as a way of talking about, the exercise that one goes through when one does this work. So it's partly about gesturing toward a particular body of scholarship that pre-exists mine, and I basically couldn't do this work without. Matt has also become increasingly interested in Ernst, and I'd have to talk to him about it again now, because he sort of like seesaws back and forth between bibliography and hard media archaeology, depending on what he's working on. But it was mostly a way of sort of alluding to that and saying, I'm indebted to this, and you need to understand this in order to make sense out of what's going on here.
I have a question for you about the boxes, to come back to that. And when I first, saw your lab, we sort of talked about like the idea of, scanning these images and all that.
Yes.
Have you made progress? Or so you've got like, because you were talking about like your students databasing everything, and do they at the same time take pictures of these boxes?
Well, this is the other thing, and it's like both with that and with the forensic work. If you want to talk about cultural technique, when I thought I have to photograph this, I realized that I hadn't picked up an SLR since SLRs had film in them. So I had to learn how to do digital macro photography, again, which was complicated. And in part, my eyesight is going, so I can't read things on circuit boards. So I literally need a macro lens to make sense out of what's going on in front of me. But the way that you photograph things, of course, like it affects your sense of what the thing is. So when all of these tiny little pictures of chips, figuring out how to get the right component in the foreground and fade everything else out has become important. How to get the lighting right, because color is really important when you're talking about these objects. How to get the picture plane straight, getting a light tent, like all of that stuff matters. So how you scan, how you color correct, which is something that I haven't thought about since I was at Coach House. So again, there's like a whole series of technical problems that are just about producing the images that are now very much in my mind. And the students are working on the database, but if I'm going to get this done, I'm going to have to teach them how to take the pictures too, because I literally cannot do all of that myself. But I take dozens and dozens of pictures every day now, and it's many of them I know I'm going to have to take again because the lighting isn't right or something out of focus.
And is that the kind of interdisciplinary that the dean of arts would like you to ship your boxes across campus with your rugged car to their and where they do? I mean, do they have a photography? I don't even know that part.
See, but, the photography cluster is literally right around the corner from me, but they don't do that kind of photography, right? Because they all do these like large sort of still life tableau pieces that they output on these enormous giclée printers and assemble in pieces, but they don't even have a light tent. So you start to realize that workspaces are so dependent on the practice of the people inside them that most of the things that you would assume are going to be there are not there if you don't have that kind of scholar in that space. So, it is weird, but this happens all of the time. And the corollary is sometimes you find things that you didn't expect to find that suddenly become very useful. So I want to do a paper about scrounging, like where one gets equipment, and who one gets it from, because again, it involves this level of social engineering that one might not assume would have to be part of doing this kind of work. But simply finding the right monitors is all about figuring out who runs which supply depot for which department and how you get on their good side and whether they'll give you their gear and how long you can keep it and all of that kind of stuff. So it's it's really kind of complex, and it keeps me very busy.
What kind of documentation do you put in for each item?
Well, the metadata scheme that we're using for the database, for reasons of convenience, follows pretty closely on the one that Lori built for the Media Archaeology Lab at Boulder. When her students built the website, they built it as flat HTML though, so it's not a database. It's just lines of text on a page. And I think her standard was originally adapted from Dublin Core, so it's something that a librarian would recognize. There are fields that I'm going to have to add that she does not have, and things that I want to be in there that aren't there yet. In a lot of ways, the metadata is pretty recognizable to anyone who's ever looked at archival records. One of the things that one of my students suggested in the summer, though, that I definitely want to do is keep a kind of usage log.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Because there is a log in the depot, and every time anybody does anything in there, it gets described. But I would like to have a field in the database as well that says, this console was last taken out on such and such by these people, and we did the following things with it, just so you have a kind of history of use.
But do you keep an history of use and how to use?
Yes.
Yes,
Well, that's the other part of it is, again, just figuring out how this stuff works is really arcane. So,
do you have a wiki, for example?
Well, they're scattered all over the place, but I've started to try to assemble that, because there are something like, we have a GameCube that's been modified to output an HDMI signal. But in order to get into the configuration menu for it, there's this weird combination of button presses. And it's if you don't know what it is, you have to go looking on the web for it to figure out what it is. And at some point soon, that won't be there anymore. So that kind of thing I try to log. The other thing that we have to keep updating constantly is the firmware to make all of this stuff work. Firmware is the software that lives on the chip inside the machine. And in many cases, to make the machine do what you want it to do, you have to have a particular version of the firmware, or you have to have a version of the firmware that someone has modified in some way. And again, finding that stuff and modifying it is tricky. And then getting it to work beyond that is also complicated. But you also start to learn things about the culture around the technology like that very, very quickly. Like we have these two devices made by this company called Analog. And the first one that they released is called the Analog NT. If Apple made an NES, it would be the Analog NT. It's carved out of a solid brick of aluminum, and it's like the most perfect Nintendo machine that was ever not created by Nintendo. The guy who designed the chip also jailbroke the chip. So when you get it out of the box, it will play Famicom cartridges and Nintendo cartridges. But if you know where to look and you go and you get the software, which again was created by the guy who designed the chip with the blessing of the company, although for legal reasons is kept at arm's length from anything to do with the company. If you know where to find this, you put it on an SD card and you stick it in the side of the machine, And suddenly your little machine will play basically every 8-bit cartridge game. So Atari 7800, Atari 2600, ColecoVision, WonderSwan, and on and on and on. But in order, like the amount of tacit knowledge that you have to have in order to get to that stage is just ridiculous. Like you have to know it's possible. You have to know where to look. You have to get the version that will actually make it work and not destroy your device. And then you have to have the temerity to actually do this to this insanely expensive little device that you've just bought. So by the time you get to that point, the likelihood of anybody making it through that chain of negotiations has, been reduced to a very, very small group, and it's probably not most people in universities.
The last level.
Yeah. So part of what we're trying to do is to take that kind of expert knowledge and put it in forms that other scholars can recognize. So at the same time as we're trying to produce papers for peer-reviewed journals, we're producing technical reports and white papers. So like with the Nintendo modding project, for example, we have a very pragmatic document that just says, okay, if you want to mod a Wii, this is how you do it, and this is what you might do with it, and this is where you go to get everything. And short of actually providing the pieces, which I don't want to do, that's about as useful as we can be, I think. And then there are the kind of theoretical and technical reasons for why you would do this or what the implications are on top of that. But yeah, like that, trying to make that stuff legible is a really important part of the project, because too much of the discourse around any technology, but around games in particular, is deeply exclusionary.
Comments?
Statements of outrage.
Then please join me in thanking Darren again for a wonderful presentation. And our fourth and final CRIHN member speaker series will be Martha Boni dans 3 semaines, vendredi 6 avril, à 13h en bas sur la base de données, série télé, etc. J'enverrai un courriel à tout le monde.
Thanks.